So let's go ahead and get started. We know we have about 90 minutes today. We have a lot to cover. So welcome, everyone, and thank you for joining us for today's conversation on the Sector Health Report. I'm Dr. Akila Watkins, President and CEO of Independent Sector, and I'm thrilled to have you with us today. The Sector Health Report represents a collective effort among leading research institutions to examine the health of the charitable sector through four key pillars: finance in the economy, workforce, trust and governance, and public policy and advocacy. This work helps us understand where we stand today and how we can strengthen the sector for the future. I'd like to extend a special thank you to our partners at the Urban Institute and at the Nonprofit Finance Fund for their invaluable contributions to the 2025 Sector Health Report and for joining us in this important discussion. Today, we'll highlight key insights from the 2025 Sector Health Report and explore practical strategies to address the challenges it identifies as we move forward in this new year. So, with that being said, and thanking you again for joining us, I'd like to welcome my colleague, Kevin, and pass it on to him.
Thank you, Akila. Hi, everyone. I'm Kevin Miller. I'm the Director of Research for Independent Sector. I'm going to be your MC for today. So I'm going to be walking you through some great discussions with visiting experts and with independent sector staff, all about the report and the health of the sector. Before we jump into my slides, I wanted to go ahead and make sure everyone knows that the report is fully available online at this point. So this is a new thing for us. We're very proud. You can look at it on your phone or your desktop. The health of the U.S. nonprofit sector report can be viewed either way, and still as a PDF. So if you scroll down at healthysector.org is the URL for the report. If you scroll down, you can download the report as a PDF if you prefer it to as a PDF and want to print it out. However you like to look at the data. So yeah, so we're excited to be able to do that for you all this year. And then I'm gonna now share my slides for today's work. So one moment. Sorry, going from window to window challenges me sometimes. All right. Uh, Sharing. All right. There we go. All right, everyone. All right. So yeah, at least as I said today, we want to share some of the findings, but mostly we want to give you all an opportunity to ask questions of independent sector staff and of our visiting experts. So please do use the Q&A function. I'm going to talk a little bit about the report itself, why we did it, what's in it, and then we're going to spend time with two visitors on what we're calling a mini panel, focusing in on what the research says specifically on workforce and financial issues for nonprofit organizations. And then we'll have a second mini panel focusing on advocacy and trust, but with a more of a focus on what independent sector is doing about all these issues right now. So we're going to cover multiple topics from a couple different directions. Hopefully it'll be interesting and engaging for you all. Again, please use the Q&A function. We really do want to hear from you. All right. So the report itself is a reflection of our strategic framework as an organization. So when independent sector talks about our strategic framework, we talk about these four goals that organizations and the sector itself should be powered by a thriving workforce. They should be financially robust. They should be trusted, well-governed, and effective, and they should be informed and active advocates. So these four issues are the things that we've decided to center in terms of understanding how the sector is doing. They're not they're not an exhaustive list, but they are, we think, a useful way of understanding how the sector is doing. We want this resource to share, vital information with sector leaders, but also with the public and with policymakers, and that we want it to be something that people can use to educate and advocate around their individual missions and organization missions, as well as the sector as a whole. So again, we're going to have a few opportunities for you all to give us information about yourselves and what you see in the report. So we're going to have an evaluation survey at the end of this whole webinar, but we also have a couple of opportunities in the web report itself to tell us who you are and how you're using the report, which we really value that information. And as always, you can always reach out to us directly at Independent Sector and say, I want more information on X, Y, or Z. We love to hear from you. And again, we want this to be as useful as possible, and you all can help us do that. I also want to point out here that the report is, we're trying to balance tracking long-term trends and perennial issues for the sector with addressing current events and crises as well. So there are things that are ongoing issues for the sector and that are serious issues that we address to some extent in the report and in our other work, like a shortage of the people with the right skills to fill certain roles, financial insecurity for nonprofit workers, burnout and stress. And then there are crises that we also address in this report. So this report actually was first published in 2020 during the COVID pandemic. And so we had a lot of focus then on how the pandemic was affecting nonprofit organizations. And we know that 2025 has also been a really difficult and complicated year for a lot of nonprofits as well. And so our report tried to address that with the available data. There isn't always timely data on everything we want to talk about, but we shared what we had. I also want to emphasize that these four themes you see on the screen are deeply connected. So obviously, organizational finances restrict much of how organizations can respond to challenges and opportunities. So it's difficult for organizations to offer certain benefits or respond to certain advocacy challenges if they don't have the money or the staff to do those things. So we're also very aware that these are our goals for the sector, and these are things that we see as strengths that we want organizations to have. But we're also aware that there are restrictions in what people in individual organizations can do. So with all of those things in mind, I want to move on to our first mini panel. So I'm excited to introduce Elise Miller, no relationship to me, and Laura Tomasco. Elise is the Senior Director for Community Engagement at Nonprofit Finance Fund, or NFF for short. And Laura is the Senior Policy Program Manager at Urban Institute. These are two organizations that, they not only produce research that's really relevant to what the sector is experiencing right now, but they even more importantly, they fielded those surveys last year during 2025 during a lot of the difficult times for the sector, and so we were really excited to bring them on and talk about again both perennial issues the sector is facing and what their data and surveys tell us about that, but also we're hoping to pick their brains about some of the ongoing unique challenges of 2025. So without further ado, I will ask Elise to walk us through a little bit about NFF's State of the Nonprofit Sector survey.
Thank you so much, Kevin. It's wonderful to be here, to be partnering with Independent Sector on this with Urban Institute, and to have so many folks join us from all across the country and many different types of organizations. So I'll speak a bit about the state of the nonprofit sector and a couple of the key findings, especially related to the economy and finance, and then Laura will speak about urban. So the state of the nonprofit sector that NFF field seeks to understand the financial health of the sector and really how nonprofits are contributing to community prosperity. We really see it as a megaphone, a way to lift up voices and data to show how nonprofits keep communities strong, and what they need to keep doing so. We started the survey in 2009, and we fielded this survey every few years. Our 2025 edition was our 10th, with 2,206 respondents representing 48 states, budgets ranging from $0 to over $20 million, urban, suburban, and rural communities, and sectors like arts, human services, and education. So why do we field the survey? We know that nonprofits are community infrastructure. They're feeding families, educating children, providing care, yet they're often not treated as such, as infrastructure, and are often operating behind the scenes. And the survey really helps us to understand what are their financial and operational strengths and challenges, and to advocate for changes that can support the entire sector. So there's data we collect in every survey, like whether nonprofits are experiencing surpluses or deficits, whether demand for services is increasing or decreasing. And this year, we also looked at things like the impact of government funding, the policy landscape, worker well-being, nonprofit economic contributions, and how post-pandemic shifts have impacted nonprofits. A couple more details, and then we'll get into what some of the findings were. The survey was open for about 6 weeks, starting on January 30th. So if you remember to around this time last year, the same period we were all hearing about and responding to the very first executive orders. The other thing I'll note is that we use a convenience sample. So this data is not necessarily nationally representative, but rather the respondents offer a snapshot of what the community infrastructure that is made up of nearly 2 million nonprofits across the US looks like. And it gives us an indication of trends and themes. In addition to our national report, this year we also published reports on the data in 7 local geographies, both cities and states, and also produced a public-facing dashboard, which allows anybody to filter key survey questions by organization sector, by budget size, and state, and really use the data to learn and to advocate. So we can put a link to that here, but we encourage you to check that out if there's specific information that you're interested in taking a look at. If you go to the next slide, Kevin, I'm gonna transition to speak a little bit about what are some of the key trends on finance that we're finding, what we know about how nonprofits have been doing financially and operationally over the past few years. And I encourage you, in addition to the sector health report, to check out NFF's website and report as well for more information and really the full results from our survey as well. The bottom line that we found is that nonprofits really entered into 2025 on already fragile financial footing. And then we're faced with an environment of uncertainty, of funding pullback, and growing community need. And at the same time, as community infrastructure, we really saw nonprofits continuing to show up to serve communities, to employ residents, and really stand up for the community. We saw them contributing to and building communities and the economy in significant ways, and even in the face of extreme challenge. So some of what we heard really in the survey really echoes long-standing challenges that we've heard about really since our first survey. Nonprofits that have described and are describing underfunded work, late payments, dollars with strings attached, and just the pressure to do more with less. I'll say that the last survey that we did prior to 2025 was in 2022, and we saw somewhat of a disruption to this trend in 2022, when the pandemic and racial reckoning prompted a lot more flexible funding and major public investment. And we saw that many respondents to that survey actually reported a stronger financial footing than we had seen in previous years. But in 2025, and perhaps unsurprisingly, on top of longstanding challenges, the survey really painted a picture of 3 colliding and very concerning crises. And so the first you can see is inflation. 86% of respondents to our survey reported that high costs due to inflation affected their organizations and their clients in 2024. Second, funding declines. 84% of respondents that had government funding in 2024 expected cuts to their funding in 2025. 65% of those expected those cuts to be greater than 10%, so having a real significant impact on their revenue. And the third, ballooning community need. 85% of respondents expected demand for their services to increase in 2025, with less than half expecting to meet that demand. So we know that these 3 dynamics aren't isolated, they're interconnected. And this data really confirms many of the experiences, the feelings, the stories that we've all been living about and living and hearing about daily. So specifically, if we go to the next slide, I did want to share a couple of charts that show what we did see when it comes to financial health. and really thinking about walking into these three colliding crises, how prepared were organizations to navigate these dynamics? Whether an organization was in California or Vermont, or with a $0 budget or a $50 million budget, we heard about and we saw in the data costs rising and funding not keeping up. And what that led to is that surpluses, which are essential for nonprofits to innovate, to expand their service hours, to fix their broken heating systems when they break, they weren't the norm in 2024. We saw a startling percentage, 36% of respondents that reported an operating deficit in 2024. And one thing I'll note, and we can see on this slide, this is a higher percentage reporting a deficit than we've ever seen since starting our survey. The chart on this slide shows that surplus and deficit data from fiscal year 2014 to 2024. The green bars showing the percentage of organizations reporting a surplus that year, the blue bar break-even results, and the red bar the percentage reporting deficits. And one of the things that we found is particularly alarming is that we can see here in our 2022 survey, we saw some of the highest rates of surpluses. And in our survey just 3 years later, the lowest rates of surpluses. We go to the next slide. I want to share one more indicator that we looked at in terms of financial health, and that was months of cash. And we think of months of cash really as a proxy for how well an organization might be able to weather crises or to invest in new opportunities. And we saw that over half, 52% of organizations reported having 3 months or less of cash on hand when taking the survey. 10% had less than a month of cash on hand. So that means that if their revenue suddenly stopped, and we know that many organizations did navigate this dynamic, they couldn't stay afloat for a month. It really translates to a more limited ability to adapt on short notice, which we know that nonprofits are so often called to do, and were so often called to do in 2025. On a positive note, I will share there were some positive notes and bright spots in our data, but on this point in particular, one of the things that we did find is that about two-thirds of respondents in this survey reported having reserve funds set aside specifically designated for emergencies or opportunities. So separate from what's on this slide, months of operating cash, many organizations are setting aside funds proactively, really thinking about how to adapt in the future. Now, we don't know the magnitude of those reserve funds, but I will say it is a higher rate than we've seen in many of our past surveys. And I think pointing to some promising financial management and planning practices as well. So I'll sum it up here. I know Laura is going to share a lot more on some of the workforce challenges and how this all connects. But we see from this data that really, even in early 2025, at the very start of a lot of change unfolding, that community infrastructure provided by nonprofits was in trouble walking into 2025. And behind these numbers are stories. I know they look like charts on a page, but they're nonprofits stretching every dollar, staff working for less than they deserve, and communities losing access to critical services. And we also see stories of strength, and some of that comes through both in the data that we have and in a lot of the narrative and the qualitative data that we collect as well. So we heard a lot about nonprofits contributing economically, collaborating in new ways to navigate this picture, and really finding ways to creatively keep the lights on and keep showing up because their communities and all of us really rely on it. So I will pause there. I know we're going to get into a lot more discussion, but Kevin, I don't know if I'm turning it back to you or right over to Laura.
I can turn it over to Laura, but thanks for checking. Yeah, so thanks so much for all of that. At least it's really important data. And for those who aren't already checking the chat, we are dropping links to the NFF's survey report and resources in the chat, as well as IS resources and other related resources as we go. So I will now turn it over to Laura from the Urban Institute to talk about some workforce trends.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. Thank you, Kevin, Akila, and Jay for inviting me to speak on this webinar. And Elise, I really appreciate your work collecting and sharing this important data. I'm looking forward to this conversation. My name is Laura Tomasco, and I lead Urban's Institute Center on Nonprofits and Philanthropy, which has been providing data and insights on nonprofits, charitable giving, philanthropy, and civil society for the last 30 years. And I appreciate the chance to be part of this webinar with Nonprofit Finance Fund and to have our data from the Nonprofit Trends and Impact Study included in the Sector Health Report, which is such a vital resource to the field. Before I dive into the nonprofit trends workforce findings in the report, let me provide some background information about the study from which these nationally representative findings come. So as you all know, nonprofits are essential to U.S. communities, but for years, the only nationally representative panel data on nonprofits came largely from IRS Form 990 filings. Valuable, but limited and lagged. Akila made this point in her introduction to the report, and Kevin talked about it today. Access to timely and reliable data on the sector is as urgent as ever. And the idea for the Nonprofit Trends and Impact Study originated back in 2015 when members of our team convened more than 70 researchers to design a better way to tell the sector's story. With initial funding secured, which included in-kind support from independent sector that we were so grateful for, our three partner institutions, Urban Institute, George Mason University, and American University, launched the first national survey of nonprofit trends and impacts in 2021. And we've fielded it every year since then, now entering our 6th year. This allows us to link responses year over year, providing timely, reliable data on trends in the sector on topics such as programming, workforce, sources of revenue, communities served, government funding, civic engagement, and much more. Each year, CEOs of 501c3 public charities with annual expenses and revenues of $50,000 or more are asked to take this nationally representative survey. We send the survey to randomly selected nonprofits that engage in activities ranging from direct service provision to community building and advocacy, and nonprofits that primarily receive rather than provide funds. The study has excluded foundations as well as hospitals, higher education institutions, schools, churches, and other houses of worship, as well as other organizations that have unique business models and contexts. And what we do once the responses come in is we weight the data to account for the sample design and the non-response to ensure national representativeness of the data, which essentially means that the findings can be generalized to the categories of service providing public charities that we include in the study. And for simplicity, I will just refer to them as nonprofits. And now in the next few slides, I'm going to show you our study's findings on staff benefits and volunteers. So our study shows that 68% of nonprofits expect demand for their services to increase in the next year. And now to meet this demand, nonprofits need to be able to maintain and recruit staff. And for many nonprofits, volunteers also play a key role in meeting community demand. So this first figure here shows reported benefits offered at staff nonprofits. So in the sector health report, independent sector noted that there can be a lot of variability across the sector and benefits provided. To understand the variation, we added a survey question about the types of benefits that nonprofits provide and how nonprofit leaders believe that those benefits are affecting their staff recruitment. Here we can see that while about 3 in 4 staff nonprofits provide vacation and about 2 in 3 provide sick leave, fewer provide key employment benefits such as group health insurance plans, 45%, dental, 39%, vision, 34%, and retirement benefit with employer contribution is 38%. These findings on nonprofit benefits are important to keep in mind in the context of other research showing that nonprofit workers face challenges such as burnout and low pay. Next slide, please. We next wanted to understand how nonprofit leaders think the benefits that they offer affect staff recruitment. So what we found is that only 40% of nonprofits report that the benefits they offer have a positive impact on staff recruitment. And about a quarter of nonprofits actually think their benefits have a negative impact. When we looked at how nonprofit leaders answered this question in relation to the benefits they provide, we found that organizations that offer more benefits are more likely to report a positive impact. In particular, offering health insurance appears to be especially important. Most nonprofits that report a positive impact offer health insurance, while few nonprofits in the report that report a negative impact do so. So this suggests that offering more benefits, and certain ones in particular, can be a strategy to improve staff recruitment and retention. And if you want to see more detail on how each one of these benefits aligns with impact, if you check out the report, the figure on, it's actually figure 17 on page 17, so easy and convenient to find. And next slide, please. Lastly, let's take a look at how nonprofit leaders report the importance of volunteers. Half of leaders say that volunteers are important, which means they depend on volunteers for a wide range of tasks or for several key tasks. And almost a quarter of nonprofit leaders describe volunteers as essential to the work, defined as depending entirely on volunteers to carry out their work. And so this demonstrates the crucial role that volunteers play in carrying out the missions of nonprofits and specifically meeting community demand. With that, I will pass it back to you, Kevin.
Great, thanks so much. We are so lucky to have you both here, and I want to take a moment for both Laura and Elise to come back on camera, and we'll try to address some of the questions that have been asked in the chat and some general questions that we've thought people might want to know more about. So first off, so this is I'll make this a broader question. We've got a question about funding cuts or drops for the sector related to the ARPA cliff. So that the end of that federal program that was passed during the pandemic crisis, right, to provide more infrastructure funding for the country. So I think it would be useful to hear from both of you again about like general trends in funding for the sector, right? What can you tell us about like over the last 5 years? Like, what did we see in terms of the increases, decreases, sources? Like, what do we know about how things have been changing?
Sure. I'm happy to also, just to that question specifically, and I saw the question about ARPA funding. We don't have necessarily a way to disaggregate kind of what is driving that, but what I will say is the phrasing of the question we asked was more specifically as a result of the 2024 election results. How do you anticipate your government funding to change or something like that? So I do think that there can be some of those post-pandemic changes and totally separate from election results, but that is how we phrased our question. And so our hypothesis is that kind of a lot of the responses that came in were really folks responding to what they felt was a direct result of what came or what might be coming down the pike. Do you want to dive into the broader, Kevin, your broader question about funding trends in particular?
Yeah, if you guys can, if you have something to say, if not, I can switch to a different question.
Yeah. So one of the things I'll say, we do ask questions about what revenue sources drive the nonprofit business model, how organizations are making their money and spending their money. That tends to be fairly consistent, survey after survey. And so we see individual donations really as the revenue source that most organizations, I think it was 88% in our survey this year, report having access to, and then foundation and government funding. Those tend to be the three top sources that we hear about. In our 2025 survey, looking at 2024, it was about 80% of organizations that accessed foundation funding in 2024, and about 71% of organizations that accessed government funding, whether from a state, federal, or local level. And And as that some of the data we reported on, we heard about changes to those funding sources. I spoke a little bit about anticipated changes to government sources, and our survey can really only speak to those anticipated changes in 2025, given the time period that we fielded the survey. One of the things we also asked about, though, are how changes in foundation funding practices. So we know that in the COVID era, 2020 and beyond, many foundations changed the way that they worked. They got more flexible, they got more nimble and quick in providing support. And in many cases, the grant sizes increased as well. So when we looked in 2025 at folks' perceptions of how foundation funding practices changed, many did report some of those positive practices from the pandemic funding era continuing. So, for example, a majority of organizations saying that funding has continued to get less restrictive and more flexible. But one of the things we heard is that organizations also reported that foundation grant sizes decreased. A majority of organizations saying grants on average from foundations have gotten smaller. Very few saying that their grant funding, their grants have gotten larger, grant by grant in 2025. So it gives us also some indication, and I think that there's some other reports like from Giving USA and others that are really looking at philanthropy that are consistent with that and kind of tracking with what some of those changes have been since we last looked at this in 2022.
So same question to Laura, and I appreciate at least you highlighting the limitations of what we can know from survey data based on when and how the question was asked, right? And so I'd love to hear a little bit from Laura about, I know their survey had some questions about whether or not organizations actually experienced disruption in their funding in the first half of 2025. So I'd love to hear a little bit more about that.
Yeah, absolutely. And I can quickly just tie in an ARPA response and then sort of shift to there. So one thing to note is the way that we asked our question about government funding losses. The question was that has your organization lost government grants, contracts, loans, or other government financial assistance since January 1st, 2025? And in parenthetical, we wrote, i.e. funding agreements canceled or committed funds pulled back. So the intention in the research that we've done on the government funding losses was to try to disaggregate and figure out, like, yes, there might have been some expected losses because perhaps COVID funds were ARPA funds were dwindling throughout the year. We have been tracking the percentage and share of nonprofits that reported getting COVID relief funding. Our last figure came from how much nonprofits reported having in 2023, which was 27%, said they still had some COVID relief funding. So it was certainly still present, but the data that we have on disruptions is trying to get at something slightly different than just general cuts it might be having. So, Kevin, to your question about the government funding disruptions, because this is a big thing that our center has been focused on this year. So we've definitely seen ways that 2025 disruptions have affected nonprofits. Our research is looking at a period that we're calling early 2025, which is essentially January 1st, when respondents took our survey. We asked respondents when they took our survey, which was either between mid-April and late June, about any losses or freezes or stop work orders that they had received from January 1st up until the date they took the survey. And we found that 33% of nonprofit leaders reported experiencing at least one of those. So the most common was a delay, pause, or freeze in government funding. 27% of nonprofits reported experiencing that. The second most common was a loss of at least some kind of government funding. And that was the question wording that I read out loud that was really intending to get at like an unexpected loss of government funding. That's at 21%. And then less commonly was receiving a stop work order at 6%. In our research, we call these nonprofits that experience at least one of these events disrupted nonprofits. And we definitely saw effects on the workforce from government funding disruptions. Some that were specific to nonprofits that experience disruptions, but some that were general to the whole nonprofit sector. So, three primary findings here. The first is that disrupted nonprofits were almost twice as likely to report decreasing their total number of employees compared with all nonprofits. So, the number for disrupted nonprofits was 27% compared to all nonprofits, that was 15%. Secondly, we found that nonprofit layoff plans shifted sharply. So the share that planned to lay off staff more than doubled from the end of 2024 to early 2025. It went from 3% to 7%, but it quintupled to 15% for disrupted nonprofits. This more than doubling of nonprofits that have layoff plans, regardless of whether they experience a disruption, does show that the effects of 2025 are hitting all nonprofits, even those that weren't disrupted. And similarly, for the third and last point, nonprofit hiring outlook was less positive in early 2025 than at the end of 2024 for all nonprofits. We ask nonprofit leaders every year if they plan to hire new staff in the next 12 months. When we asked this question at the end of 2024, 53% of nonprofits said they plan to hire staff in the next 12 months. But when we asked that question in spring 2025, that share had fallen to about 38, 39% for all nonprofits, regardless of a disruption.
Thanks so much. We have a ton of great questions, some of which we'll probably have to come back to at the later Q&A portion, but I want to ask one more question specifically for Elise and Laura before we move on to our other mini panel, which is around, I want to ask a little bit about benefits. So we had one question about how the benefits in the nonprofit sector compare to the for-profit sector. My guess is that we don't have great data directly comparing them, but I'm curious if either of you know of a comparison. And then the other great question was about federal, state, or local benefits requirements for health benefits and how that affects nonprofits offering benefits. So either or both of those questions before we move on to our next mini panel, if you guys have anything to share.
I think it's such a great question. I unfortunately do not have data, particularly on the different levels of government requirement, but I would love to see that out there.
Yeah, on that question, we don't have direct data on it, but it is something we can look at in different ways. So I did mention one of the things that we did is take a look at this data in specific local geographies. And so there are, if you take a look, there are reports on NFF's website that have data from a couple of different states and geographies. So we have Georgia, the Dallas-Fort Worth area, New York City, Greater Philadelphia, the Bay Area, Hawaii, and Los Angeles. And one of the things we do see are some differences in benefits rates in those places. Now, it doesn't directly speak to causation that, like, because of state or local benefits requirements, that is the thing that is driving that. But it can provide an indication where you see big differences, for instance, in a huge number of organizations providing health insurance in one city, and that number is a lot lower when we look at the respondents in a state, for instance. It points to some of those differences. So if you take a look at some of our local reports on our website, for those places specifically, you can see some of that benefits data by location and begin to get at that. I think Jen just put a link to that in the chat, but it can provide some insight there.
Great. Thanks so much, both Elise and Laura. We're going to shift gears a little bit to talk about advocacy and trust and governance with Vanna and with Dr. Akilah Watkins, our CEO. So I'm going to start us off. I'm going to share my screen to talk a little bit about some of the data in our report, and then we will ask some questions to Vanna and to Akilah. All right. So again, we just spent a good amount of time, though not nearly enough, to cover everything, talking about finance and workforce issues. Now we want to talk a little bit about trust, governance, advocacy, and policy. So these are things we think of as, just as important, although sometimes the data is harder to get on some of these issues. So I want to briefly summarize some of our findings on trust, and then I'll ask Vanna to talk a little bit about what we know about advocacy in the sector and what we're doing about it. So we know that nonprofits remain the most trusted sector in the United States. We are more trusted than um, the military, law enforcement, people in your community, and importantly, more trusted than philanthropy, which is unfortunate because individual donations, while as Elise said, they are an incredibly common source of funding for the sector, they're not a primary source of funding for most organizations. And a lot of organizations are very much dependent on large donors, so like giving from bequests, giving from foundations, and so small individual donations can't fund the whole sector. So the fact that philanthropy, that Americans are less sure they can trust philanthropy is a concern that we're continuing to monitor and think about how to address. Notably, I want to point out also that this year's trust work by independent sector found that Americans are unsure whether the sector can really be independent from the influence of powerful funders. So that drives some of their concern about how we interact with especially really large donors and how we interact with the federal government as well. Just to show just the baseline trust numbers that I was just referencing around which sectors Americans trust most or least. Again, there's nonprofit organizations at the very top. 57% of Americans say they have high trust in nonprofit organizations to do what's right. That's how that question is phrased. And you can see it drops off a lot after nonprofit organizations, all the way down to the federal government in last place. Only 18% of Americans have high trust in the federal government to do what's right. I think these numbers are fairly consistent from 2024. This is a survey that we run annually with our partners at Edelman DXI, Data and Intelligence. And so these are a representative sample of the American public. And so we can see here that, for instance, high net worth individuals, high net worth donors are trusted less than private foundations. And so there's some variation here across like different types of philanthropy. I want to note in particular, as a human being and a resident of the United States, one of the most concerning numbers here is that only a third of Americans have high trust in people in their local community, and that number has dropped significantly in the past couple of years. And so that's something that a lot of sociologists, a lot of nonprofit sector professionals are concerned about because of the role that the nonprofit sector plays in bringing communities together and serving communities and promoting civic engagement. And so the fact that people are pulling away or feeling more disconnected from their local communities is a real concern that we are thinking about. Again, regarding government funding, so this is an interesting sort of, again, a connected point to our previous topic on funding sources and how the sector manages itself and funds itself, which is that we, in our survey of the American public this year, asked about, again, first, how do you generally trust? Do you generally trust the nonprofit sector? Again, 57% said they have high trust in the sector to do what's right. We then informed, the folks we were surveying that that many nonprofits have a significant amount of government funding, and then we asked after that, how much do you trust nonprofits to do what's right? And that number went from 57% to 38% after learning that. And so this is, again, a major problem for our sector. Again, for many nonprofit organizations, their business model depends on government funding, whether it's federal, state, or local, or some combination. And so the fact that merely getting government funding results in this drop in trust, sort of guilt by association with government, is a major issue for the sector that we're thinking about ways to address, especially thinking about, how do we message clearly about the sector, our responsibility to communities, the way that we're governed, and how it's different from, corporations governance. We are thinking actively about this at IS. So, but that one was a real punch, frankly, to see that one. One of the ways we know to sort of sustain trust is by making it in terms of messages that work with the public. One of those things is around separation from partisan politics. At this point, partisanship is just a huge driver of so much sentiment and opinions in American society. And just a quarter of Americans say they told us they have high trust in nonprofits to remain neutral during elections. And for those of you who don't know, there's something called the Johnson Amendment, which is one of the rules that restricts what nonprofits can do and maintain their tax exempt status. The Johnson Amendment says that nonprofits cannot endorse a candidate in elections. So we are legally required to remain neutral when candidates are running for office. And when we explain that to people, a plurality of Americans say that knowing that makes them trust nonprofits more, and that repealing it would make them less likely to trust nonprofits. So this is an area where independent sector is leading, advocacy for the sector to sustain the Johnson Amendment. There's been interest in Congress and this administration to get rid of the Johnson Amendment, and we are saying very loudly that that's not a good idea, that it will reduce trust in the sector, that it will divide the sector. And so that's something that independent sector is continuing to work on, and we encourage you to get involved through our website and through other coalitions if you are able to do so. And speaking of getting involved in advocacy, I'm going to turn it over to Vanna, our Director of Advocacy and Engagement, to talk about what we are trying to do to get organizations engaged.
Thank you, Kevin. And before I start to talk about what we can do, I want to give a little background and acknowledge some of the advocacy data that is shared throughout the Sector Health Report and that independent sector has been working hard to produce over the last several years. And so as you saw on an earlier slide, the 4 pillars that we mentioned, one of the other ways that we can measure sector health is by how much the sector is engaging in public policy and positioning themselves as active and informed advocates. IS has done extensive research on the levels at which nonprofits are engaged in advocacy. Data from our PIN survey, as you can see by the graph that I'm showing on the screen here, shows that nonprofits are engaging at significantly lower levels than they were 20 years ago, with the biggest gap appearing in the area of lobbying legislators, with about 75% of nonprofits reporting that they've never lobbied. The significance of this decline, I don't think that I have to remind anyone on today's call, the significance of this has never been greater. We are seeing ongoing attacks to the sector through things like the stripping of grants, threats to our nonpartisan status, as Kevin mentioned, the Johnson Amendment, weakening our ability to hire and retain top talent, as you saw the data on previous slides. It's more critical than ever that nonprofits work to develop a real strategy for engaging at the local, state, and federal levels. Our research has shown that there are many reasons for a decline in engagement, most notably a lack of time and capacity for some of our smaller nonprofits, but there's also a significant lack of understanding about what is permissible for nonprofits to engage in advocacy. So you'll see on the next slide, as we dive a little bit deeper into the knowledge around what's permissible, a lack of awareness and education on legally permissible advocacy has been identified from nonprofit leaders as one of the 2 largest obstacles to engaging in policy advocacy, along with a lack of resources and capacity. As our data showed in 2000, over half of 501c3 organizations, about 54%, said that they knew that they could support or oppose legislation. Today, that number is only about 32% of nonprofits reporting that they're aware of the fact that they can oppose or support legislation. One trend that has been pretty significant, that's been pretty consistent across our data, shows that nonprofits have a pretty good sense of what they can't do as it relates to advocacy. But there seems to be a significant knowledge gap around what nonprofits are legally able to do. And you can see that displayed here on the data, the drop off in folks in 2022 answering these questions right about whether or not they can support or oppose federal regulations and legislation, whether or not they can host a candidate forum. So there is a significant knowledge gap around what's permissible. And so on the next slide, I want to just talk a little bit, like I mentioned, the significance of the landscape that we're all living in. I feel like I don't have to remind folks, we see it every day in the news and in our communities. But there's never been a more significant time to engage. We are operating at a time of intensified political pressure. Nonprofits are increasingly pulled into public debates, whether we choose to engage or not, we're being pulled into them. And like I mentioned earlier, the sector is just facing real threats around funding instability, shifting federal priorities. We're seeing expired or defunded grants and federal credits, heightened scrutiny about how nonprofit dollars are being spent. The reality is that policy decisions are being made every day that affect our ability to serve communities, often without the sector's voice at the table. Secondly, just remembering that advocacy is not optional. And I'll talk a little bit in a second about what independent sector is doing to help organizations more confidently step into advocacy. But many organizations still see advocacy as risky, political, or just this extra thing that they will do on the side if they have time, and not the core component to mission strategy that it should be seen as. Not engaging in and of itself is a choice that oftentimes has real tangible consequences for organizations. And therefore, these times should warrant nothing without us, nothing about us without a strategy and approach from the sector. And finally, there's a call to shift from this being a moment of retreat to a moment of real strategy for nonprofits. And what do we mean by strategy? I'll talk a little bit more about that when I talk about some of the resources that are available, but things like knowing what's legally permissible and using the full range of tools that are available to nonprofits. Aligning boards, staff, and coalitions around shared priorities, that's often a point of contention is, boards having a different vision as to whether or not organizations should step into advocacy and what that work looks like. So alignment is really key in developing a strategy. And then engaging early, not waiting until harm has been done and being reactive, but knowing what's legally permissible and stepping in and impacting and affecting policy before decisions are finalized. And so how are we responding? What is independent sector's response to some of the research that we've been doing over the years and have been putting out? We are launching let me step back and say this. I was brought on at Independent Sector about 6 months ago in the role of Director of Advocacy and Engagement, in large part to start up and to stand up a lot of this work, a lot of this advocacy programming that I'll tell you about here. But we're launching a new training program series this spring. It's designed to get nonprofits at every level engaged in advocacy. This spring series will kick off an ongoing larger advocacy programming here at Independent Sector, but it's designed to address some of the recommendations from our Earning Influence report, which is one of 3 reports that we put out related to advocacy over the last 3 years. But some of those recommendations that this advocacy training will focus on is training to help nonprofits adopt and adjust their daily practices to influence policy. A lot of what we've been hearing in our research is this issue of time and of capacity to engage. And so we're really going to be focused on helping people step into advocacy with minimal disruption to their day-to-day activities. Best practices for building and maintaining relationships with policymakers, educating nonprofit leaders and boards on the role of advocacy in their mission success, and then expanding access to specialized advocacy resources and tools. This year, you'll see on the second bullet point there, this year, we're also updating one of our flagship pieces of work here at Independent Sector, our 33 Principles of Good Governance. We're going to be including advocacy as a core principle of nonprofit practice in that guide. And so this work, once we have completed it in early to midsummer, will result in a set of guiding questions and discussion prompts that nonprofit boards can use to determine how to step into advocacy. We know that advocacy is not a one-size-fits-all thing for organizations, and our hope is that this work will position boards to make informed decisions about how their own organization strategizes around advocacy. And like I said, that work will be completed later in the summer to go with the full 33 principles update that will come at the end of this year. And then lastly, of course, it is a midterm year. We'll be putting out resources around civic engagement for nonprofit leaders as well. So more to come on that as well. I did want to, while these advocacy resources are things to come in 2026, I did want to share with you all some resources that are already available. On the next slide here, you'll see a tool that we recently launched last fall, I believe actually not fall, last December, we recently launched this tool. We're very excited about it. It was launched also in response to some of the research that we've been doing around advocacy, identifying needs of organizations as we look at why organizations are not engaging in advocacy. One of the bigger, larger issues that we were seeing is that organizations who are connected to coalitions are advocating at a larger rate, excuse me, at a bigger rate than those who are not involved in coalitions. So last year we launched this tool, our nonprofit coalition connection tool. Using this tool, you can search and connect with coalition leaders across the country who may be working on similar issues, may be serving similar populations as your coalition. You can scan the QR code that's there on your screen. It will take you to the Nonprofit Coalition Connection tool. Feel free to interact with it. Search by state, search by advocacy level, by policy issue. If you would like to add your organization to this Coalition Connection tool, there's a link about halfway down the screen that you can click. And there's a quick form to fill out to add your coalition's information. We'd love to get you all, if you're connected to a coalition and don't see your coalition listed there, we'd love to get you all in this database so that you can be searched and found by other leaders looking to connect and boost and strengthen advocacy work. And then lastly, I wanted to share our state data profiles with you all, another tool that was released or just updated just last fall. Our interactive state data profiles. Here you can find state to state data as well as stories about the size of the nonprofit sector, its economic impact, both paid and workforce data. We've also updated it to include ALICE data to look at financial security in the nonprofit workforce. A link to the state profiles, I believe, is going to be shared with you all in the chat. So please check out this tool, share it with your networks, and use it in your advocacy efforts. So with that, I would imagine you all probably have a lot more questions for either Kevin, myself, or the earlier panelists. So I will turn things back over to Kevin to take us into Q&A.
Thanks. We're going to start with just you, Vanna, and Dr. Akila Watkins, who's back on camera. Hi, Akila. So we're gonna focus first on questions on trust, advocacy, engagement, right, policy, and then we'll have some time to bring Elise and Laura back and just throw it wide open for whatever questions people want to ask. So on policy and advocacy, I think we can start with sort of the combo question, right? Which is one of the things we see in our work from the trust survey is that Americans aren't sure they can trust nonprofits to be involved in policy with government, with elections, even when it comes to things like just nonpartisan voter engagement and things like that. And we see that essentially anything connected to government, right? Again, there's this guilt by association problem where when the reality is nonprofits are very involved with policy or should be, and we're very involved with keeping people engaged. But frankly, a lot of people don't trust anything to do with the government or policy. So what can we do about it? Like how do we strategically approach advocacy and policy work in a way that sustains public trust? How do we, communicate about what we do and why? Like, where do we start with that work? It's a big one. Sorry.
It is a big one. I was sitting here trying to figure out where to start. I think I would say, advocacy, engaging effectively, starts at a most basic level with organizations making it a part of their core like operations and their culture as an organization. And if I were to take a step back even further, I would say just like I mentioned earlier, organizations understanding what they can and can't do. Many are not engaging because they think that, oh my God, I'm threatening the C3 status of my organization. When there's that in reality, there's a lot that nonprofits can do. And so getting clear on what it is that you're able to do, getting clear on what it is that you all want to do, what makes sense for you and your organization in terms of how to engage, shifting your organization's, sort of the way that you talk about things internally to understand what types of things would be helpful to your organization to be able to engage in advocacy, data that you're already collecting, programmatic data that you're already collecting. How can we use that, repurpose that data to present to legislators to make our case for certain policies? And so it really just has to be just a cultural shift internally that starts with, again, just understanding what you can and cannot do. That's a huge hiccup and a huge sort of speed bump for organizations. Akila, I don't know if you have anything to add there.
Yeah. Excuse me as I get over the flu this week. So, this is one, to Kevin's earlier point, that we really wrestle with because we know in order for the material reality that most Americans live in to be changed, we have to work with government. But when we do, our social trust, the level of social trust we enjoy from the public, it gets a ding. And part of what I think could be helpful in this is transparency, right? Like, I think Americans, inside those numbers, and Kevin and I were in the room when we first saw those numbers and had to grapple with how do we, improve the material reality and deal with what happens, the interaction effect that happens when we work with government. And I think I walked away with saying we need more transparency. We need to be able to articulate clearly, no fancy words, no fancy terms to the general public. This is how we work with policymakers, and this is how we keep our integrity in that work. I do think there's some things we're going to have to change and update as we work with policymakers, um, because there may be some things that really do hamstring us, right, in our ability to be as honest as possible. So I think one is we take this information, this data, and we sit with it. And we really do a very honest analysis of all the ways in which how we currently work can help produce mistrust. And then we correct those ways. And then we should better articulate in the clearest language we can how we work with government in a way that preserves our integrity.
I also want to ask a question about Anna. You said that that advocacy isn't optional. That there are real risks if we don't do it. Right? Can you talk a little bit more, and Akila as well, about what we stand to lose as a sector if we're not fully engaged? Right? And if there are any particular examples you can think of, right, of where independent sector or other nonprofit organizations have had an impact by standing up, by being involved in advocacy, whether that's legislative, regulatory, or legal, right? Like what are things that, either again, broadly, generally, or specifically that we stand to lose if we're not engaged enough?
That's a good question. And I think particularly these days we are seeing, a lot of organizations being reactive, not by choice, but by, just sheer nature of how quickly cuts are happening and how quickly people are being blindsided by things that this administration is doing. And so, what some of those consequences are, folks on the call may be impacted. Like I said, cuts to grants. We saw cuts that happened on this past Tuesday. SAMHSA, who is the agency that oversees mental health and substance abuse grants. We saw I think it's estimated about $2 billion worth of cuts that happened overnight to organizations affected who do work in mental health and substance abuse. About 2,000 grants total across the country. And so, things like that sometimes are beyond our control. You don't foresee that happening. And so there's really not a way to be proactive when it comes to things like that. But one of the ways that I'm seeing that both IS as well as other organizations are sort of shifting their advocacy efforts is stepping into the legal arena a lot more. When you're seeing these cases where you're blindsided with funding cuts, many times going to the courts is your only recourse, attempting to file suit, taking things to court as opposed to going the traditional legislative route that we typically see with advocacy. And so I think being nimble, being able to pivot, and I know that some of our smaller organizations, perhaps, being able to step into the legal arena is not an option. I think that's where partnership comes, coalition work becomes very critical, is partnering with organizations who maybe do have a stronger legal muscle. But I think just being flexible in this time to the extent that we can be proactive as you kind of see, the writing on the wall, the administration is attacking other types of organizations. I think we all have to be alert, all have to be on our toes and anticipate that cuts are going to come our way soon and just think about that strategy in the background, like I said, stepping more into the legal arena. So I'll pause and see if Akila has anything to add there. And Kevin, maybe I only answered a fifth of your question. I feel like your question was a lot larger, so feel free to ask follow-ups.
And Vanna, I have nothing to follow up. I think you said it perfectly.
So we have a question from the audience on particularly like how do organizations manage the risk of the current political climate? Now, and I think when we ask Laura and Elise to come back with us, I think I think that's a question that spans all of our health areas, right? It's about finance, it's about workforce, but like first coming at it from an advocacy perspective. How do organizations, and this person asked about BIPOC and tribal entities particularly, how are organizations, especially BIPOC-led organizations, managing the risk right now? What does that look like for people? What have you all seen?
Um, I don't mind sort of jumping in and then I could turn it over to all the experts, Vanna and such. So, a couple of things. One is that we do need to engage our boards at this time when we think about sort of our risk tolerance. Um, I do think it's important this time to also engage legal counsel, right? So you all, as an organization, can really think about and assess what your sort of risk tolerance is. Every organization is different. Vanna talked earlier about one of the key strategies that we're using at this time as a sector um, is lawsuits, right? This has not been sort of part of um, the personality of the sector, but this is a new tool that we're utilizing. You have to assess whether or not your organization has the ability and has the tolerance to undergo something at that level. I mean, there are a lot of different levels, but I'm only using sort of litigation as one level to see what your risk tolerance is. If you are a BIPOC or a tribal-led organization, and we understand the just very toxic environment in which you all have to operate in, it's important to understand again, what's your risk tolerance? Are you comfortable with being very explicit about your mission statement and understanding what some of those consequences are? How comfortable you are with listing your partners? Um, Being able to sort of understand what information is out there about you and your organization and what is not. So just sort of doing that due diligence as an organization is going to be super important at this time. Seeking legal counsel, getting your board members involved, and then there are some just sort of clear steps in order to just preserve the safety of your organization too, depending on what state you live in and sort of what political environment you're in. You may have to take just different steps, and that's why it's going to be important for you to sort of seek counsel, seek sort of legal counsel, so you can understand all that. So those are just some of the suggestions I have, but it's important right now, just really clearly to understand and do an assessment of your risk tolerance.
Vanna, did you want anything or?
No, I don't have anything to add. Thanks, Kevin.
Yeah, can add something, which is that I was just in Alabama to give a presentation hosted by the Alabama Association of Nonprofits, which is an IS member. It was a great group of organizations who were there in the room, and they talked about specifically about DEIA threats and about what they're allowed or not allowed to do on DEIA right now. My point that I want to make is that the answer to that question may depend on where you are. So Alabama, Georgia, and Florida are the 11th Circuit, and in those states, the Fearless Fund case that made it where the court ruled essentially that private foundations can't give money on the basis of race, right? Like they can't specifically grant to a program to support Black men entering an area where they're underrepresented, or things like that. That's the law of the land right now in Alabama, Georgia, and Florida. And it's not the law of the land in the rest of the country, which is in part because the defendants in that case, or I guess it was plaintiffs. Sorry, I'm not a lawyer. The Fearless Fund folks decided not to appeal to the Supreme Court because they were concerned the Supreme Court would make that the law of the land for everyone. And so some of the legal answers depend on where you are, both for federal law reasons and for state law reasons. And so it's worth pointing that out. I want to ask Elise and Laura to come back on camera and we can sort of toss it to everybody because again, Nonprofit Finance Fund and Urban, have questions in their surveys on all challenges that organizations are facing, not just on finance and workforce. And so I want to see if we can throw some of these complex, difficult questions from the audience to all of you and see what we can do. So we got a great question around innovative funding models, and we got two questions on it actually, right? Like, what are we seeing or hearing, or what are we proposing or suggesting, right? Any of the above to how organizations get funded. What's happening? Is that shifting? Is it not? What's going on in terms of funding models?
Yeah, that's a great question, and I saw it come up a few times in the Q&A, both thinking about nonprofits and also thinking about kind of what funders are doing. I know there was a question about loans in there too, which I can speak to as well. We did ask a qualitative question in the survey, which is how folks are expecting to be impacted by the change in administration, and then how folks are planning to respond as well. And so start to hear about different funding models. I will say this is one that comes up with every change and crisis, is really thinking about collaboration. And I think in many times people's minds jump straight to mergers and acquisitions, and that's certainly something that's coming up in the field more. But I think what we hear about more often and comes through both in the survey, but also some of the work that NFF does, is really organizations exploring things like programmatic partnerships, like shared services. I know in a couple of different geographies, there are kind of like shared human resources or shared legal. I know Akila mentioned kind of the need for legal support. So some of those things are coming up as well. And you might not first go to say collaboration is a funding model, but it is something that can fundamentally change either the revenue structure or the cost structure of an organization. And so I think of it as innovation in funding. We heard about organizations leaning into earned income strategies that they might have or might have already had that might not be so reliant necessarily on some institutional funding sources. Not necessarily the first thing that comes to mind when innovative, but we heard about simply ramping up capacity for fundraising or tapping into new types of donors. A lot of organizations saying corporate donors, which maybe weren't on their radar previously. That came up in a lot of our qualitative responses. And then the last thing I'll say, and it is connected to collaboration and connected to funding models, is we really see a lot of organizations coming together to advocate in different ways and to join forces, but to advocate locally and to local government, and what types of supports or resources can be unlocked that can really support the broader sector and the broader ecosystem. Um, I'll say very briefly, because I think it's related. I know there was a question that somebody asked, which is any innovative funding models such as locally funded revolving loan funds created exclusively for nonprofits? Are revolving loan funds typically less restrictive in its potential usage? And I want to answer that here because I do think we focus in a lot in the survey on nonprofit funding models, but we're also seeing a lot of ways that funders, foundation funders or local public funders are really stepping up. We saw a lot of this in the COVID era too, and with some funding changes, and we're seeing it again now. NFF, I don't know if we shared this, but we are a community development financial institution. So a big part of what we do is work on making loans and financing to nonprofits. And we are increasingly uh, connecting with and hearing interest from and seeing interest from foundations and others who are looking to put some of their dollars not only toward grants, but also toward loans, which really can be a great strategy to support organizations that are managing and really navigating delays in funding. Uncertain funding, for example. So we saw this a lot during COVID. Organizations uh, foundations, for instance, coming together to subsidize loans so that they're able to be no interest loans or very low interest loans, or to have more flexible terms, for instance, to be made to nonprofits that are below a minimum loan threshold. And so there were a lot of those we saw in COVID. We actually just launched in partnership with the city of Riverside and San Bernardino County, the Inland Empire Nonprofit Loan Fund, really existing to help organizations manage cash flow and strengthen operations and expand their work, particularly in underserved communities in the Inland Empire. And so I think of kind of that as a strategy as well that might not always be at the forefront for nonprofits and foundations, but definitely a lot of opportunity, especially as public and private grant funding or contract funding gets pulled back as well.
Other folks, Laura, you came off mute.
Yeah, I really appreciate the question. I think it's such an important one to think about, like, what are people doing and pivoting in this moment? I mean, I think it really speaks to resilience of the nonprofit sector and the ability of nonprofits to make changes. When we looked at the effects of the early 2025 government funding disruptions, we did find that there were programming impacts. So we found that compared to all nonprofits, if you had a government disruption, you were twice as likely to report reducing your total number of programs, people served, and program locations. What I think is also important to note here is, like, when you look at the data points, like the percentage of nonprofits, like the disrupted nonprofits was somewhere in kind of the 20 to 25% range. So that means, like, if you look at the opposite side, there was a lot of nonprofits that didn't do all of those things to their programs. And figuring out and uncovering that story of resilience and pivots is something that we plan to do in our sixth survey. It's going to be launching later this month. And one of the questions that we're going to add in this year is to really drill down and understand what changes were made to be able to sustain services. And we're also going to have added new questions on the workforce, thanks to support from the independent sector. And we're really looking forward to that and just being able to have more data to inform this conversation about a story of resilience, and helping folks understand how it is that nonprofits are able to continue meeting community demand, while recognizing, of course, that for some nonprofits, this is a very challenging period. For others, they're able to find ways and strategies to overcome.
Yeah, and then I want to broaden the question a bit. So, like, promising funding models was the original question. I think, it's always good to highlight what's happening that's good in the sector, right? What are people doing? What is independent sector doing? But what are our peer organizations doing, right? What are our friends at the National Council of Nonprofits or the Council on Foundations, right? Like, what's happening either at the national level or state or local levels? Like, where are there state associations or just individual organizations that are coming out swinging, whether that's, in a advocacy way or just in terms of how they're delivering services or handling this moment. So if anyone has, inspirational stories, information, sources to find that sort of stuff, I think people would love to hear it. And if not, this is a really bummer question if we have no examples. So
I'm happy to chime in. I don't see any.
Go ahead, Elise. I was
Oh,
going to just
oh,
put
you
forth
can.
another shameless plug, Kevin. I was thinking hard. I've been on a number of calls this week, and sorry, maybe I'll come back with an example in a moment, but I think that was one of the reasons I want to plug again our uh, nonprofit coalition connection tool. This is the very thing that we want to do is connect people so that folks can hear those stories, especially when you're feeling discouraged. We know that advocacy is especially tough in these times. And so connecting with organizations who are doing great work in other parts of the country is key. So if I think of an example, I'll come back in 30 seconds, but I did want to plug our coalition tool again.
Thank you, Vanna. I shared a little bit about collaboration. I think there are some great examples happening in a lot of places and nationally in that space. One of the things I wanted to lift up, and I think Jen might have shared it in the Q&A as well. I think that there's a lot of we talk about advocacy, and there's also a layer to public awareness around the nonprofit sector and how nonprofits are really our infrastructure are ingrained in, I would say, everybody's life in some way. Whether you're born in a nonprofit hospital or you're going to an after school program. And so Jen shared a little bit about National Council of Nonprofits Get It Done campaign, which I think is an amazing kind of effort to lift up the real value and importance of nonprofits, which are really important messages in folks traditional from sort of philanthropy and folks that might be in our ecosystem every day, but also folks that aren't as well versed in nonprofits to really understand and get a sense of what's going on in the sector and ways to support. Locally in New York, I know there's been some work by Trinity Wall Street, the Heart of New York campaign, which is very in a similar way trying to lift up nonprofits as the heart of New York. And so I do think some of these campaigns, which are a little bit different than what we might think of in some of the advocacy we do, have sprung up and can have a real power behind what the future model for our nonprofit ecosystem and our funding model looks like, which requires kind of bringing in perhaps new and different stakeholders than those that continue to support our sector, but that we've continually relied on.
Yeah, and I'll point out that independent sector is currently spinning up a project on messaging and how we build trust in the sector through trusted messengers and what messages resonate with people, right? And so we know from some of our previous trust studies that local trust is important, right? Trust in local organizations is really critical. And so how we translate that to the national level and emphasize, right, the whole sector in the whole United States is performing a lot of these important roles, and that it's important to support organizations locally, but also at the state level and at the national level, and figuring out how we communicate that best. And so that is something that we are also working on. Let's see. So we got a lot of questions in the chat, and let me do a time check quick. I think we have time for one more question, and I'll stop here, which is just, with the nonprofit sector feeling, and in some ways, concretely being under attack, right, in 2025, having our funding disrupted, having, our integrity questioned. What do you all see as key strategies for responding in this moment, apart from things we've already discussed, or if you just want to reemphasize things we've already discussed? How do organizations individually respond, and then how are and Laura and I are researchers, so we have our responses. We should collect some more data on that, but that's not so much an inspirational answer for most people. So it can be part of the answer, and that it can help guide us to figure out what's effective and what works. But I just want to, for our last question, figure out, is there anything else that you all want to mention in this moment? What are you thinking about? And what are organizations doing? What's something that you're taking away from 2025 into 2026 about this moment?
I can just start with a little bit on the topic that Urban has focused a lot on, which is again the government funding disruptions and what to think about that. I think, one thing that I look a lot at is really just the overall diversity of funding that nonprofits receive. Our data shows the average nonprofit gets about half of its revenue from private funding, about 28% from government, 18% from earned revenue, and 4% for other. And I think there really is strength and opportunity in this diversity. You don't see any one source completely dominating. And I think certainly what I'm going to be interested to look at in the data in the coming year is any shifts we might be seeing in that 28% from government funding. Are we going to see that number stay consistent? Are we going to see shifts in the number of nonprofits that receive government at the state, local, and federal level? Are they going to kind of move around based on how this year is happening? I think certainly the effects of federal funding cuts are felt at the state and local level as well because money trickles down. And so I'm really interested to see how that all pans out. But again, I feel like this diversity in revenue and funding models is something that nonprofits can take through a period of turbulence, whether or not you get government funding. There's an overall shift in the ecosystem, and having that balance can be a strength.
I would, Kevin, this is sort of piggybacking off of what I mentioned earlier about, the shift to more of a legal strategy, especially in these times. I mean, I think I would back it up and just say, what I'm thinking about for 2026 in terms of strategy is like for people to get very serious and very intentional about their own organizational strategy. And we're not just talking going to talk to legislators and lobby legislators on a piece of legislation, but I mean real strategy internally about how leaders and staff operate if your particular nonprofit is under threat. So understanding, your rapid response reaction to things that are happening, understanding where your support lies. Is that support legal counsel? Is that support members of Congress who could come to your aid in times of need, knowing your rights as an organization, regardless of the threats that are coming your way. I think that's key is knowing your rights as an individual organization. So taking this time while things are rapidly happening to make sure you have a system in place that your staff understands what you all are permissive, what you all are legally permitted to do. And just like I said, in case something happens, what your strategy as an organization is going to be. I think that's the worst thing that could happen in these times is if people are caught off guards and you don't know what to do next. So just that front end preparation is what I would suggest and what is top of mind for me.
I'm going to ask Akila to close this out, but before I do, I'm going to ask Elise to give you one last chance because Laura and Vanna just talked. Is there anything else you want to drop? Any wisdom you want to drop on us before I ask Akila to close us out?
Yeah, I was gonna double tap on something that Vanna said. I feel like 2025 was a shock to the system for many, and I think there are continuing to be changes, and there will continue to be uncertainty and a lot that is thrown at nonprofits and for nonprofits to navigate. But also, I'm hopeful it can be a moment to also not only be in that responsive mode, but to think about prioritization and strategy going forward and kind of build off of some of that creative responsiveness that organizations really navigated last year to figure out what does this mean for the future, because the reality is there are a lot of crises that the past few years have brought, but there are a lot of long-standing and systemic challenges in our country and in the nonprofit sector. And thinking about what does this recent adaptation mean in terms of navigating that. And as I mentioned just before, kind of emphasizing the real social and economic impact of the sector. We're not just filling social good, we're employing people who are spending their dollars locally, putting it back into the community, who are paying local vendors. And that is so critical to continue to come back to and to continue to lift up in thinking about the future of the sector.
Akila, any closing thoughts?
Well, let me just say that, first of all, Kevin, let me just thank you for helping to MC us today. You did an incredible job moving through such incredible, rich data. I also want to thank our panelists, Vanna, Laura, Elise, The knowledge and perspective you bring to this work is deeply invaluable. Like it was mentioned today, 2025 brought an incredible, unprecedented challenge for the sector, and only because the sector has been incredibly strong and resilient have we been able to get through 2025. And we know that there are a lot of lessons to learn. And one of the things we want to be able to do with these sessions is to be able to reflect and learn from, our current world and how do we become stronger. And like Elise said, the nonprofit sector just doesn't do good. We actually are an economic engine for the sector. Um, so, with that being said, I want to just thank everybody for joining us today. Please complete the post webinar survey that is in the chat. I also want to thank the team, the independent sector team, and the other teams, Urban and the National Finance Fund, their teams that helped put this webinar together. We have a lot of incredible informational um, um, data to be sharing throughout the year. So I encourage you all to continue to go to our website. If you're not a member of IS, please become a member of IS. And we hope to see everyone at this year's National Summit in Phoenix, Arizona, October 13th through the 16th. So, with that being said, um, we're closing out.
Thanks, everyone.